Something rare is happening across Canada. Something quiet, something unplanned, and something that's starting to shake the entire North American auto industry. It didn't begin with rallies, hashtags, or political speeches. There was no national call to action, no celebrity endorsements, and no fiery commentator telling Canadians what to buy. Instead, the shift started with something far more powerful than any political slogan. Simple, everyday decisions made by millions of people at dealership lots, repair centers, and household kitchen tables. For decades, Canada and the United States were tied together through one of the most deeply integrated auto markets in the world. Vehicles crossed the border every minute. Parts moved back and forth like they were flowing through a single country. And buyers rarely thought twice about whether their next car was made in Michigan, Kentucky, Ontario, or Mexico. But then, almost suddenly, everything changed. In 2025, numbers revealed something nobody saw coming. Canadians were quietly walking away from US-built cars. Not out of anger, not out of nationalism, but because the math shifted, the incentives broke apart, and the trust that once held the market together began to thin out without a sound. What unfolded next didn't just hurt car sales. It reshaped an entire continent. It started like a faint signal, barely noticeable, almost invisible. A dip in demand. A slight change in shopping patterns. A few dealerships on the Canadian side of the border reporting that foot traffic felt lighter than usual. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. But then, the numbers landed like a thunderclap. For the first time since the 1990s, Canada imported more cars from Mexico, 1.08 billion Canadian dollars, than from the United States, which slipped to roughly 950 million Canadian dollars. No government announcement, no media spectacle, just the cold clarity of trade data revealing a massive shift in Canadian buying behavior. People weren't angry, they weren't protesting, they were simply choosing something else. Border towns in Michigan and New York noticed first. For decades, Canadian buyers crossed into the U.S. for deals, service, or model availability. Then suddenly, they didn't. Dealerships that used to live off Canadian weekend surges reported quiet showrooms and slow service bays. It felt strange, almost eerie. And the strangest part was this. No one had told Canadians to stop buying U.S. vehicles. They just did it. But beneath that silence was a cause, a structural shift years in the making. And that shift didn't begin with tariffs, politics, or speeches. It began with something far more basic, rising prices and weakening trust. The moment that accelerated everything came from Ottawa. Canada announced a 25% counter tariff on US-built vehicles that didn't meet updated North American rules under KSMA. That move, simple on paper, hit Detroit harder than any organized boycott ever could. Suddenly, US-made cars became $3,500 to $12,000 US more expensive, depending on parts sourcing. The gap wasn't symbolic. It was financially crushing. For a family comparing two SUVs, one built in Kentucky and one built in Ontario, the decision wasn't political. It was painfully obvious. And here's where the story gets even more interesting. Only companies that met their investment and production commitments inside Canada were granted relief. Detroit's Big Three didn't. Toyota and Honda did. Almost overnight, Japanese and Korean models assembled in Ontario and Quebec became the smart, predictable choice. No tariff surprises, no unstable supply chains, no fear of sudden price spikes. Some industry analysts quietly argued that Washington underestimated Canada's willingness to respond. Others said Trump's tariff push created chaos that the U.S. couldn't walk back from. Either way, the result was clear. The tariff didn't create the shift. It simply exposed it. And this exposure forced everyone to confront something deeper. Long before tariffs made headlines, Detroit had already been pulling back from Canada. slowly, quietly, year after year. Ford's Oakville plant shut down its EV project entirely after repeated delays. Stellantis ended production of the Chrysler 300C in Brampton. GM failed to meet its local production commitments and lost nearly a quarter of its duty-free quota. None of this happened with fanfare. It wasn't front-page news. But Canadians noticed. When a company stops building locally, stops investing, and stops treating the market as a priority, customers feel the shift. By 2024, Canada's auto output had fallen to just 1.3 million vehicles, one of the weakest years in decades. A quiet message was being sent, even if Detroit didn't want to admit it. Canada was no longer central to the Big Three's strategy. Insiders say the retreat began long before tariffs. Executives were prioritizing U.S. plants, shifting resources south, and tuning Canada into a secondary market. And when you make a market feel secondary, buyers respond. Industry rumors suggest some Detroit executives privately acknowledged the mistake, claiming the company took Canada for granted. Whether true or not, the public saw the result. Fewer Canadian-made options, higher prices, fewer accessible models. And that silence, Detroit's slow backing away, created the perfect vacuum for someone else to step in, which is exactly what happened. While the Detroit Three scaled back, Japan did the opposite. Toyota and Honda didn't just build factories in Canada. They built ecosystems, stable supply chains, high-efficiency operations, and models Canadians loved. RAV4, CR-V, Civic, NX, RX. Familiar names, now with a powerful advantage. Local production with no tariff shock. Toyota's Cambridge and Woodstock plants became the only North American locations producing certain Lexus and Toyota models. Meanwhile, Honda solidified its dominance with consistent output and predictable pricing. By the time tariffs hit U.S.-built vehicles, Toyota and Honda already controlled more than two-thirds of Canada's total vehicle production. Some industry watchers claim Toyota saw the tariff clash coming and planned years ahead, focusing on Canadian production for maximum resilience. It's speculation, but the timing certainly feels strategic. The result? Canadian buyers turned toward what felt stable and trustworthy. Even before tariffs, these brands had earned loyalty. After tariffs, they became unstoppable. As U.S.-made models sat on lots longer and longer, Toyota and Honda units were selling out. And this was just the beginning. Because the next wave wasn't about Japan, it was about America's own industrial heartland. The first real shock didn't hit Canada, it hit Michigan. As Canadian buyers walked away from U.S.-built cars, Michigan's export revenue faced immediate risk. Normally, the state sends over $23 billion in goods to Canada each year. Now, that pipeline was shrinking. Parts suppliers in Ohio and Illinois saw tightening orders. Factories experienced slowdowns as Canadian demand cooled. Engines built in Canada for Ford's F-250 and F-350 arrived in American plants with higher input costs, making final prices more painful for U.S. customers. Then came the physical evidence. Cross-border freight over the Ambassador Bridge, one of the busiest auto corridors in North America, fell by more than one-third compared to the previous year. Fewer trucks, fewer shipments, more anxiety. Border towns that rely on Canadian shoppers felt the pressure too. Gas stations, dealerships, and small businesses saw northern customers vanish without warning. Some local reports even mentioned staff wondering if something was wrong in Canada. But the truth was simpler. Nothing was wrong. Canadians just stopped buying U.S. cars because the incentives disappeared. And while the Midwest was tightening, Canada was doing the opposite. If Detroit was struggling, Canada was accelerating, fast. Since 2020, more than 46 billion Canadian dollars in EV and battery investments poured into Ontario and Quebec. Honda's $15 billion Canadian mega project promised a complete ecosystem, from materials to assembly, all inside Canada. The auto parts sector surged from 8 to 10 billion Canadian dollars in GDP, and employment pushed past 80,000. Canadian supply chains thickened, capacity strengthened, and foreign automakers preferred Canada over the US because the political environment was calmer, more predictable, and more strategic. Meanwhile, analysts began discussing a new concept, the Canada-Mexico axis. As U.S. manufacturers fumbled between tariffs, political volatility, and production inconsistencies, Canada and Mexico built a trade corridor that felt efficient and reliable. Some experts say Canada now influences the continental EV market more than Detroit. Others believe Ottawa's long-term EV bet is positioning Canada as a global clean manufacturing leader. What's certain is this: while U.S. companies were losing ground, Canada wasn't waiting around. The country used the moment to build an industry that's leaner, cleaner, and more resilient. But the most surprising consequence wasn't industrial. It was psychological. Something unusual is happening across Canada. Something so quiet that most people didn't even realize they were part of it. There's no leader, no protest, no trending hashtag, and no dramatic speech urging Canadians to reject anything. Yet the outcome looks exactly like a boycott, a silent one, a powerful one, and most importantly, one that no government on either side of the border can negotiate with. The shift began the moment U.S.-built vehicles jumped thousands of dollars in price after the 2025 tariff changes. For families comparing two nearly identical models, the math made the decision for them. A $5,000 to $12,000 difference isn't a political debate. It's a simple calculation. Choose the option that doesn't strain your finances. That option, almost every time, was a model built in Ontario or Quebec by Toyota or Honda. And the more Canadians made that choice, the more obvious the pattern became. Dealerships noticed their U.S.-assembled inventory sitting longer. Financing agents reported customers asking whether a vehicle had any U.S. parts at all, something they never cared about before. Some analysts say this new consumer caution is rooted in financial fear. Others believe it's a subtle shift in trust. There's even online buzz suggesting that Canadians feel burned by years of Detroit scaling back its presence in Canada. It's speculation, but it reflects a changing sentiment. This wasn't emotional. It wasn't patriotic. It was practical. When stability lives on one side and volatility lives on the other, consumers will naturally drift toward the safer choice. And once that drift begins, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. A boycott with signs and slogans can end. A boycott created by economics has no finish line. It lasts as long as the numbers keep pointing in the same direction. And right now, those numbers are only accelerating. But what happens when this silent shift begins reshaping the entire North American auto landscape? The answer lies in what unfolds next. North America isn't breaking, it's reorganizing, and the center of gravity is no longer where anyone expected it to be. What began as a subtle shift in consumer behavior has now grown into a transformation that touches every corner of the continent. Manufacturing, jobs, exports, supply chains, and even political leverage. And the most surprising part? None of it was planned. It emerged naturally, silently, from millions of everyday decisions. As U.S.-built models lose ground, Canada and Mexico are rising side by side, forming what analysts are now calling a new manufacturing axis. Ontario and Quebec, once treated as secondary by Detroit, have become high-efficiency hubs for EVs, hybrids, and premium Japanese models. Meanwhile, Mexico has strengthened its role as the continent's low-cost, high-volume production engine. Between these two pillars, a new auto corridor is forming, one that doesn't depend on Detroit the way it once did. The shift is already visible. Billions in EV and battery investments are flowing into Canada. New supply lines between Canada and Mexico are tightening. Companies planning 5 years ahead are choosing stability over volatility. And right now, that stability isn't in the United States. Rumors in industry circles suggest that some U.S. automakers are quietly lobbying Washington for a renegotiation of tariff rules because they fear losing control over the very market they once dominated. It's unconfirmed, but the urgency behind these whispers feels real. And this raises an uncomfortable question for Washington. What happens when Canadian consumer choices carry more weight than American policies? For decades, the U.S. assumed it dictated the direction of the North American auto industry. But economics don't obey political assumptions. Trust doesn't return on command. And once production ecosystems shift, they rarely shift back. Canada didn't set out to reshape the continent's auto map. But through stability, predictable pricing, and consumer loyalty reshaped by simple math, it has. And if one quiet shift can do this, imagine what the next one might rewrite.